Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and continue on with our next part of our classification chapter. So we left off talking about all of the, or at least some of the recently discovered species that have been found in the last couple of years. And you've watched a couple of videos on some of the new ones, so with this last kind of section in biology, I have a lot of videos because I think they're a great way to really get you to see some of the odd living creatures we have out in this world. Okay. Now, our next part of classification looks at how we name creatures. So in class, I would ask you, by looking at these pictures, what would you name these animals? Okay, and a lot of you would be like, oh, crabs, and maybe you get even more specific, blue crabs. But the thing is, these are all not the same species. Okay, same kind of deal with this. Okay, if we're looking, we're like, okay, what would you name this? You'd be like, redfish, orangey redfish. Maybe some of you would be able to identify like the betta fish. But we're going to see that if I'm on one part of the world, okay, if I'm in South America studying our betta fish here, and someone else is on the other side of the world studying this swordtail fish over here, okay, that's what it's technically called, and we start talking about how we're studying red fish, all of a sudden we're going to realize that we are not talking about the same fish, even though we might be using the same name. And so we are going to find that common names are not going to be the easiest or the best way to identify these organisms. My last little example of why common names don't work very well is because if we take a look at this creature right here, now we know that this is our mascot, so we know that they are cougars. However, these cougars have many other names, even though they are the same species across the North America and South America continents. So we call them cougars. They can also be called other names. You might have heard of some of them. So sometimes they are called mountain lions. Okay. Sometimes, because in the Rockies they're called mountain lions. Sometimes they're called panthers. So in Central America, a lot of times they will call these panthers. And in South America, they're called catamounts, which loosely translates to cat of the mountain. Okay, so this one is not like your redfish or your blue crab. This one is actually, these are all the same species, but now we're using different names to describe them. Okay. Alright, so as you can see, common names, even though they're sometimes easier to remember than your scientific names, common names don't work on a global scale. Okay. So what we see is that there are many animals out there, and plants too, that can resemble each other. So your like generic names of redfish and blue crab and whatever else are not specific enough. Okay. And sometimes, like with our cougar, we run into issues where the same animal can have a whole bunch of different names just depending on where we find that animal. Oh, I forgot to mention, sometimes cougars are also called pumas. They'll call those pumas down in South America too. Okay. But because common names don't work very well when we're studying animals on a worldwide scale, we have to use another name or another method for naming and classifying animals. Okay. So what we're going to use this thing called taxonomy. So taxonomy is a branch of biology that groups and names organisms based on studies of their different characteristics. So one of the reasons why in the science world we've kind of adopted taxonomy is because we needed a naming system that we could use across our planet. So taxonomy is kind of nice. It does have to be universal. So if I'm studying one species here in North America and someone else is studying a species across the world, we know whether we're studying the same species or two different species. Okay. Also with taxonomy, they need to have a biological meaning. So they don't just name things out of the blue. The naming system is actually related to, it's almost like grouping system. So the animals that are alike are going to be grouped together. So maybe all the fish are grouped together. Okay, but then they get into more specifics. Maybe we group all the spiders together and then we'll put them into more specifics. Okay, so taxonomy is nice because it's worldwide. It actually does make sense once we translate it into English, and then it does eliminate the use of those confusing common names. So a little bit about taxonomy. So we've seen this guy before. He's popped up a couple times. He's popped up like in our cell chapter, and probably a little bit in physical science too. So good old Aristotle. He was a Greek philosopher, as you know, who kind of began this science of classifying living organisms. Okay, and when he started it out, about 2,000 years ago, he classified living organisms into two groups. He classified them into plants and animals. It's a good starting point. Okay. So the plants, he kind of had little subdivisions. So his plants, he would subdivide into small plants, medium-sized plants, and large-sized plants. And eventually he got to be a little more specific and group them into herbs, shrubs, and trees. Now for your animals, he kind of subdivided the animals into air dwellers, water dwellers, and land dwellers. Okay, so dwellers meaning like where they live. Okay. Now this was a good starting point, okay, just like we've seen in other cases. Aristotle's thought of a lot of good ideas initially, but we've thus improved a lot on them. So this was a good starting point. But you can see there's going to be some problems with this. In class, I would normally have you discuss with someone around you some of these problems, but we can discuss it here. So with this, get my star out of the way. With this, if we kind of look here, okay, plants and animals. All right, you can probably think of some living things that don't fit into the plants and don't fit into the animals. Okay, what about your mushrooms, your fungi? What about your molds, your bacteria? Your different types of microorganisms, okay, all the stuff that we didn't even know existed yet, don't really fit into this grouping system. Okay. Other things, if we look at the plant category, so small, medium, large. Okay, my definition of a small plant might be very different than your definition of a small plant. Maybe to me, small is 2 centimeters, and your definition is 3 feet. Okay, so that alone is not specific enough. And if he's only looking at herbs, shrubs, and trees, he's leaving out a lot of the flowering plants. He's leaving out the grasses. He's leaving out the vegetable plants. So there's a lot of things that don't fit into that, even in the plant kingdom. And then lastly, probably the other big issue with this is air dwellers, water dwellers, and land dwellers for animals. And if you think about it, okay, air dwellers. So, birds. Birds could be air dwellers. But the problem is, birds also have to land at some point. So they're kind of land dwellers. And some birds like to be on the water, like your ducks. They're water dwellers. Okay, so they actually kind of fit into all three. Okay, a lot of your amphibians, like your frogs, will like to live on water and in air. Or no, not in air. Frogs can't live in air. Haha, funny. In water or on land. And so we see a lot of creatures don't live solely in one place. They'll live in a combination of places. Okay, so obviously we had to do a little better than this. Nice starting point, but we've got a much better way of doing things now. So as modern science developed in the 15th and 16th century, Aristotle's system was deemed inadequate for the reasons we just discussed. Okay. And then came Carl Linnaeus. So there's really only 2 scientists in this chapter, so Aristotle, which we've had before, and Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus is actually the big name in classification and of naming. So he was a Swedish biologist, and he gets the nickname of Father of Modern Taxonomy, because what he did is he took Aristotle's foundation, and then he grouped things a little bit better. Okay, so he divided organisms by their morphology. Morphology means structural similarities, so like how they're built, kind of like how spiders have 8 legs and insects only have 6. Okay, so he looked at how they were built, and he also found some of the microorganisms and other bacteria using things like the microscope, because right around this time, remember, microscopes are like the new cool thing. And then what he did, so after kind of regrouping some of the organisms that were left out from Aristotle's system, he then gave organisms a scientific name using binomial nomenclature. Okay. So binomial nomenclature, big name, all right? Binomial nomenclature, it is Latin, like a lot of other science words we've learned this year. So if we take this name and we split it up, so binomial, so bi means two, nomial means name. I think in Spanish, if I remember correctly, I hope this is right, I think the word like nombre is name, okay, which you might see at the top of your like Spanish papers if you're in Spanish. So it kind of originates from that same Latin root. So to name, and then nomenclature, there you see that like naming part right there, nomen, okay, and clature means system. So it literally means the to name naming system. And so with binomial nomenclature, they're going to use Latin, as I mentioned, I think, in our very first classification video. And one of the reasons why they use Latin is it's a language that is not changing, okay? It doesn't change from region to region. There's not different dialects of it. It's an unchanging language, especially at the time. It was also the language that was used by educated people in the time of Carl Linnaeus. Now, obviously, we don't really speak Latin now, but it's that foundation where all of our languages kind of stem from. Okay. So, with our two-name naming system, everything's referred to by two names. The very first part is the genus, which is kind of a grouping level, which we'll get into more, maybe this video, maybe next video. The genus is always capitalized. The second part of this two-name naming system is the species name, and it is always lowercase. Okay. Now, if you were writing out the names, so if you were writing them out by hand, you would underline the scientific name. And if you're typing it out on the computer, you would actually italicize it. Okay. So with scientific names, there's kind of some formatting that goes along with it. So kind of like how we have rules about how you write a sentence, there's rules as to how you write a scientific name. Okay. So for example, if we were looking at the scientific name for a wolf, okay, so Canis lupus. Canis referring to like canine dog species, lupus referring actually to like darkness and moonlight. Okay, so if we were writing it out, okay, notice the first one would be underlined. The first word is capitalized, the second word is lowercase. If we were typing it, it'd be the same thing capitalization-wise, just in italics. Okay. Now sometimes we'll see the genus name abbreviated, where you'll see C period lupus, but for this class we're always going to write the names out. Okay, so here's a little bit of practice. So in class we would do this together, but that's okay. So if we take a look at that first one, Gophorus agassiz. Ooh, we love Latin, right? Okay, so that actually refers to the desert tortoise. Okay, so the Gophorus actually is your tortoises, your turtles. And if you look, there was a mistake right here. You need to make sure that this first part is lowercase. Okay, now since this is typed out, it's all italicized, so that's good to go. Okay. This second one looks good. The Haliaeetus leucocephalus, okay, looks good. We got a capital on the genus name, lowercase on the species, but it is not italicized. So the only thing that would need to be changed is if we were typing it out, it italicized it. If we were writing it out, underline it. And that's your scientific name for your bald head. Not your bald head, your bald eagle. I was getting ahead of myself because leuco means bald, cephalus means head. There's where the bald head comes into play. I apparently need more coffee. My coffee habit hasn't stopped, so don't worry. Alright, and this last one here. So the Canis latrans is a scientific name for coyote. You might notice the canis here, referring to the dog-like or canine-like species. So it's actually in the same genus as the wolf, but notice the latrans is the different species name. Okay, so if we look here, italicized, which is good. Lowercase on species name, good. Not capital on the genus name, which means we'd have to fix that. Okay. And then from our last chapter, we know that the human scientific name is Homo sapiens. Homo meaning man, sapiens meaning wise. So our genus name is Homo, and our species name is Sapiens. And that's where I'd like to stop for today. I hope you guys are doing well. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Have a good one.